3 reconnaissance drones, 3 shots, 3 very expensive pieces of intergalactic technology tumbling out of the sky like drunk pigeons over the dusty plains of Montana. And absolutely nobody saw it coming. Except maybe Grell Vantersoon, the 73-year-old cowboy who'd just blown them out of the air with a revolver older than most functioning democracies, who didn't see anything unusual about the whole affair whatsoever. The thing about Grell Vantersoon was that he'd been shooting things out of the sky since he was 12 years old. Crows stealing corn, hawks eyeing his chickens, the occasional drone from one of those damn surveying companies that kept trying to find mineral rights on his land. He'd developed what you might call an itchy trigger finger when it came to unauthorized aerial vehicles, and he made absolutely no distinction between Earth-made quadcopters and quantum-stabilized trilaxian observation platforms worth more than the gross domestic product of Belgium. To him, they were all just flying rats. He'd been sitting on his porch, drinking coffee that could strip paint, when he noticed 3 metallic objects hovering about 200 feet above his barn. They were making a sound like a cat gargling marbles, which Grell found deeply offensive. This was his sky above his property, and whatever those contraptions were, they hadn't asked permission. The first shot was instinctive, pure muscle memory from 6 decades of defending his territory against anything that flew without feathers. The drone sparked, spun wildly, and crashed into a haystack with a sound that Grell would later describe as satisfying. Ndudi, the second and third shots, those were just good manners. Can't leave a job half finished. What Grell didn't know, couldn't possibly have known, was that those 3 drones belonged to the Quilvan Reconnaissance Corps, an organization so bureaucratic that they required 17 different permits just to change the coffee in their break room. These weren't just drones. These were certified, registered, diplomatically protected observation units conducting an entirely legal, completely authorized preliminary survey of potential Class 7 civilizations. And Grell Vantersoon had just committed what the Quilvan legal department would later classify as acts of extreme aggression against sovereign technological assets. The penalty for which, according to Quilvan law, was a minimum of 400 years in a rehabilitation facility where they made you watch educational videos about respecting other species' property. The irony, of course, was that the Quilvan hadn't actually told Earth they were surveying. They'd assumed that any civilization capable of radio transmission would naturally understand that unidentified flying objects were probably friendly reconnaissance missions and not, say, a legitimate threat requiring immediate defensive action. This assumption, as it turned out, was spectacularly wrong. 17 light-years away, in a monitoring station that smelled faintly of recycled air and disappointment, a junior technician named Plisk Harventine watched 3 vital signs flatline on his display. For a moment, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. Drones didn't just die. They had redundant systems, emergency protocols, fail-safes built upon fail-safes. They were designed to survive electromagnetic pulses, solar flares, and the occasional meteor strike. They were not designed to survive a 140-year-old Colt single-action army revolver, fired by a man who'd learned to shoot by aiming at tin cans balanced on fence posts. Plisk said, which was the sort of highly technical assessment you'd expect from someone whose entire training had focused on what to do when drones encountered expected problems, not when they simply ceased existing for no apparent reason. His supervisor, a being named Qualix Pemberton, who'd been doing this job for 37 years and had seen everything, looked over his shoulder. Define Plisk. 3 simultaneous total systems failures. That's impossible. I know it's impossible, which is why I said instead of something more articulate. Qualix leaned closer to the screen, his facial tendrils doing that twitching thing they did when he was deeply confused. Run diagnostics. Already running. Nothing. They just stopped, stopped, stopped. Drones don't stop, Plisk. They malfunction, they crash, they occasionally develop sentience and write terrible poetry, but they don't just stop. But stopped they had. 3 dots on a screen representing millions of credits worth of technology now displayed the most terrifying message in any bureaucratic organization. Error 404. Device not found. What followed was the sort of cascading panic that only truly rigid hierarchical systems can produce. Blisk notified Qualix. Qualix notified the department head. The department head notified the regional coordinator. The regional coordinator notified the sector administrator. The sector administrator notified the quadrant supervisor. And the quadrant supervisor, a being named Thorvax Windelmere, who hadn't had an original thought since the previous ice age, did what all middle management does when faced with a problem they don't understand. He formed a committee. The Committee for the Investigation of Unexplained Drone Loss on Planet Earth CLX 7743 held its first meeting approximately 6 hours after Grell Vantersoon had gone back to drinking his coffee, entirely unaware that he'd just become the most wanted man in a 17-light-year radius. The committee consisted of 14 members representing 7 different departments, each with their own theories about what had happened. The Atmospheric Analysis Department insisted it must have been some sort of electromagnetic anomaly. The Technological Security Division suggested a virus. The Xenological Studies Group proposed that maybe Earth's gravity was different than their measurements indicated, which prompted the Astronomical Accuracy Brigade to nearly walk out in protest. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, suggested that someone had simply shot them, because civilizations that still used projectile weapons didn't have the technological sophistication to even detect their drones, let alone target them with any accuracy. That was just basic logic. You might as well suggest that cave dwellers could hack a computer using interpretive dance. The committee spent 3 days analyzing data, writing reports, and arguing about whose budget would cover the replacement costs. They reviewed atmospheric conditions on Earth. They examined the drone's last transmitted data packets. They even considered the possibility of spontaneous quantum decoherence, which was the scientific equivalent of saying, "We have no idea what happened, but it sounds impressive." Meanwhile, Grell Vantersoon had buried the 3 drones in his back 40 acres, same place he buried old farm equipment, rusty vehicles, and that one door-to-door salesman who'd made the mistake of calling him elderly. Just kidding about the salesman. Probably. The drones, being sophisticated pieces of technology, had emergency beacons that activated upon catastrophic failure. These beacons transmitted on frequencies that Earth's atmosphere passed through like water through a sieve, completely undetectable by human technology. The Quilvan could track them with perfect accuracy, which is how they knew that their 3 drones, their very expensive reconnaissance drones, were currently 6 feet underground in rural Montana, nestled between a 1987 Chevrolet truck transmission and what appeared to be an entire collection of ceramic garden gnomes. This information, when it reached the committee, caused what the Quilvan would later classify as a Level 3 diplomatic incident. Not quite war, but definitely more serious than a strongly worded letter. "They buried them." Thorvax Windelmere's voice hit frequencies that shattered 2 coffee mugs and caused several subordinates to instinctively duck. According to the beacon signals, yes, sir. Plisk had been promoted to assistant junior investigator, which meant he now got to deliver bad news to important people, approximately 0.7 meters beneath the surface, in what appears to be a designated waste disposal area. Waste disposal. Our drones are classified as cultural heritage. I don't think the indigenous population knows that, sir. Thorvax's tendrils knotted themselves into what any xenopsychologist would recognize as a sign of impending bureaucratic fury. Right, that's it. We're invoking Protocol 47B. The room went silent. Protocol 47B was reserved for civilizations that showed deliberate and malicious destruction of diplomatic assets with intent to intimidate or threaten. It had been used exactly 3 times in the last millennium, and each time had resulted in extremely awkward diplomatic situations that took decades to untangle. "Sir," Qualix said carefully, "Protocol 47B requires evidence of intentional hostile action. We don't actually know what happened to the drones. They were shot down and buried. What more evidence do you need?" "We don't know they were shot down. The data doesn't show, then find me data that does show it. I want a full investigative team on the surface within the week, and I want whoever did this to understand the magnitude of their transgression." Which is how, 7 days later, a Quilvan diplomatic shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere without bothering to notify any terrestrial authorities, because as far as the Quilvan were concerned, Earth didn't have any authorities worth notifying. They were a Class 7 civilization, barely capable of crude space travel, certainly not developed enough to have proper diplomatic protocols. This assumption, like so many before it, was about to collide headfirst with reality. The shuttle landed in Grell Vantasoon's north pasture, scaring the absolute hell out of 47 cattle and prompting Grell himself to reach for his revolver before deciding that whatever that thing was, it was probably too big to shoot without more ammunition. Instead, he grabbed his phone and did what any reasonable person would do when a 40-foot metallic egg appeared in their field. He called his grandson. "Tecker?" "Yeah, it's Grandpa. Listen, there's a spaceship in my pasture." "Grandpa, have you been drinking?" "I don't drink before noon, you know that. There's a spaceship, big silver thing, making that humming noise like those drones I shot down last week." There was a pause. "You shot down drones?" "Yeah, 3 of them." "Anyway, this thing's bigger. You think I should call the sheriff?" "I think you should call the military, Grandpa." "The military? For what? It's on my property. I'll handle it myself." "Grandpa, no." But Grell had already hung up and was walking toward the shuttle with the sort of confidence that comes from 73 years of dealing with unwanted visitors, whether they had 2 legs, 4 legs, or apparently no legs at all. The shuttle's door opened with a hiss that sounded vaguely disapproving. Out stepped investigator Crinth Aldemar, who'd been specifically chosen for this assignment because of his exceptional cultural sensitivity and communication skills. Munch. What this actually meant was that Crinth was the only member of the diplomatic corps who'd bothered to learn any human languages. And by learn, we mean he'd spent 3 days with a translation device and now knew approximately 200 words of English, 60 of which were various food items he'd never eat. Crinth was tall, in the way that beings who evolved on low-gravity worlds tend to be tall, which is to say he looked like someone had taken a normal person and stretched them on a rack while simultaneously removing most of their bones. His skin was the color of old parchment, and his eyes, all 3 of them, were arranged in a triangle pattern that humans would later describe as deeply unsettling. He wore what the Quilvan considered formal diplomatic attire, which looked to Grell like someone had wrapped themselves in aluminum foil and then added shoulder pads for no apparent reason. "Greetings, indigenous sentient," Crinth announced in English so heavily accented that it sounded like he was gargling gravel. "I am investigator Crinth Aldemar of the Quilvan Diplomatic Corps." Grell squinted at him. "You're on my property." Crinth consulted his translation device, which made a sound like a confused hamster. "Property! Yes, we are investigating matter of great importance." "Are you with the government?" "Government? We represent Galactic Council of Unified Species." "Never heard of it. You got a warrant?" "Warrant?" Crinth's translator made a noise that suggested it had given up entirely. "I do not understand this word." "A warrant. Legal permission to be here. Otherwise you're trespassing, and I'm well within my rights to defend my property." Crinth made a gesture that would have been reassuring if you were Quilvan, but to human eyes looked vaguely threatening. We have authority from highest levels of galactic government. That's nice. Do you have a warrant from the state of Montana? Montana? This is a subdivision of your planet, yes? It's where you're standing. And where you're standing is my land. So unless you've got paperwork saying otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This conversation, which was being recorded by 17 different sensors on the Quilven shuttle and would later be analyzed by 64 separate experts, was not going the way Crinth had planned. The cultural briefing had said that humans responded well to displays of official authority. They were supposed to be impressed by credentials and hierarchical structures. Nobody had mentioned that humans might have their own sense of authority that completely ignored galactic protocols. We are here to investigate destruction of Quilven property, Crinth said, deciding to cut through the pleasantries. 3 reconnaissance drones were destroyed in this location 7 of your rotations ago. Grell's expression didn't change. Those metal things making noise over my barn. Yes, precisely. Highly sophisticated technological devices worth considerable. Oh, I shot those. Crinth's translator made a sound like a dial-up modem having an existential crisis. You shot them? Yep. Didn't have permission to be here. This is a no-fly zone for anything that doesn't have FAA clearance, which I'm guessing your drones didn't have. FAA clearance? Federal Aviation Administration. You want to fly something over American soil, you need permission. Otherwise, property owners have the right to defend their airspace from unauthorized intrusions. Crinth felt his training, his 3 years of diplomatic school, his entire career collapsing around him like a house made of cards in a windstorm. The human, this indigenous sentient from a barely developed world, was claiming that he had the legal authority and that the Quilven were the ones in violation. It was like being told by a toddler that you were the one who didn't understand quantum physics. But we are Galactic Council. We have jurisdiction over all non-member civilizations. Says who? Says the Galactic Charter ratified in your year, Crinth consulted his device. 1417? I wasn't there, Grell said. Neither were my parents, their parents, or anyone I've ever met. So as far as I'm concerned, that charter doesn't mean spit. But it is universal law. Not in Montana, it isn't. This was the moment when Crinth realized that he'd fundamentally misunderstood his mission. He'd thought he was coming to investigate a crime. What he'd actually walked into was a jurisdictional nightmare that made the Trilaxian border dispute of 3447 look like a simple parking violation. Perhaps, Crinth said, trying a different approach, we could discuss this matter with your planetary authorities, your leaders who speak for all humans. Grell thought about this. Well, there's the president, I suppose, but he's in Washington, and I don't vote for him anyway. Then there's the governor, but she's more concerned with taxes than property rights. The sheriff might listen, but this seems outside his jurisdiction. And the HOA can go straight to— Please, Crinth interrupted, his translator smoking slightly. Who do you answer to? God and my wife, and she's been dead 15 years, so mostly just God. And he hasn't filed any complaints about my shooting policies. Crinth made a note on his device. Political structure more fragmented than anticipated. Recommend psychiatric evaluation of subject. The drones you destroyed were worth 3 million credits each. Don't know what a credit is. How much is that in dollars? Crinth did a quick calculation. Approximately 17 million of your dollars per unit. Grell whistled. That's a lot of money for something that can't even dodge a bullet. They were not designed to dodge projectile weapons. What kind of barbaric civilization still uses chemical propulsion to throw metal at things? The kind that gets results, Grell said calmly. Look, son, I don't know what you want me to tell you. Those things were on my property without permission, making noise, probably spying on me. I defended my land. That's what people do here. You could have simply observed them, attempted communication. With drones? That seems silly. They were diplomatic reconnaissance. They were a nuisance, and now they're in the ground next to my old truck transmission. If you want them back, you're welcome to dig them up, but I'm not doing it. My back isn't what it used to be. Crinth felt something in his diplomatic training snap like an over-tightened violin string. This wasn't supposed to happen. Indigenous species were supposed to be apologetic when confronted with evidence of their transgressions. They were supposed to be eager to make amends, to prove themselves worthy of galactic recognition. They were not supposed to treat the whole affair like a dispute over a fence line. "This is an extremely serious matter." Crinth's voice went up an octave, which his translator rendered as shouting. "You have violated 12 separate provisions of the Galactic Treaty on Protected Assets. Once again, not my treaty, not my problem. There will be consequences. I'm sure there will be. But right now you're still on my property without permission, and my patience is wearing thin. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you have a warrant? I have galactic authority." Not good enough. Grell reached for his revolver, not to draw it, just to rest his hand on the grip. It was a gesture he'd made thousands of times, usually right before trespassers decided that maybe they had somewhere else to be. Crinth saw the movement and instinctively took 3 steps backward. His cultural briefings had mentioned that humans could be territorial and prone to defensive behaviors, but the briefings had made it sound quaint, like a dog guarding a food bowl. This was not quaint. This was a 73-year-old man who'd just admitted to destroying $51 million worth of equipment, and was now suggesting quite clearly that he was prepared to defend his position with lethal force against a diplomatic envoy who represented the Galactic Council. You would attack me?" Crinth stammered. "If you don't leave my property, I'll call the sheriff and he'll make you leave. Your choice." "This is outrageous. This is unprecedented. This is Montana," Grell finished. "And in Montana, we don't take kindly to people who ignore property rights. Doesn't matter if you're from Billings or from wherever the hell you're from. I am from Quilven Prime, a world with 12 billion inhabitants, a civilization spanning 400 systems. Good for you. Now get off my land." The standoff lasted approximately 15 seconds, which doesn't sound like much, but when you're a diplomat trained to resolve conflicts through dialogue and mutual understanding, 15 seconds of hostile silence feels like geological time. Crinth retreated to his shuttle, not because he was afraid, he told himself, because clearly this situation required a different approach, a more comprehensive strategy, perhaps involving actual legal experts who understood Earth's bizarre patchwork of jurisdictions and this peculiar concept of property rights that seemed to override all other authority. The shuttle took off, leaving Grell standing in his pasture, hand still on his revolver, watching it disappear into the clouds. "Damn tourists," he muttered, and went back to his porch. The report that Crinth filed upon returning to the monitoring station was 17 pages long and used the phrase "culturally problematic" 46 times. He recommended immediate escalation to the Interspecies Relations Bureau, a full anthropological study of Earth's legal frameworks, and possibly therapy for himself because he'd just been threatened with a primitive weapon by someone who didn't even acknowledge the existence of galactic law. The Interspecies Relations Bureau read the report, held an emergency meeting, and came to a conclusion that would have profound implications for everyone involved. They decided to send lawyers. Now, lawyers are a universal constant. Every civilization that develops complex social structures eventually produces a class of individuals who specialize in arguing about what words mean and why their interpretation is correct. The Quilven had lawyers. The Trilaxians had lawyers. Even the Virex, who communicated entirely through interpretive dance, had lawyers, though their court proceedings were extremely confusing to watch. But Earth lawyers, as the galaxy was about to discover, operated on a completely different level. particularly Montana lawyers, representing a 73-year-old man who'd just been threatened by aliens on his own property. Grell's grandson, Tekka Vantassoon, worked as a systems analyst in Seattle. He was 34, had a mortgage, 2 kids, and a very clear understanding that when your grandfather calls to say he's been visited by aliens demanding compensation for shooting down their drones, you do not ignore it. He caught the first flight to Montana. "Grandpa, why didn't you tell me this was serious?" "It's not serious. Some bureaucrat landed in my field, said I owed him money, I told him to leave. Same as when the tax assessor showed up last year." "Grandpa, these aren't tax assessors. They're aliens from space." "I figured that out when I saw the ship, Tekka. I'm old, not stupid." They were sitting in Grell's kitchen, which smelled like coffee and gun oil. 2 scents that had defined the house for as long as Tekka could remember. On the table between them was a laptop showing news reports that had started appearing that morning. Unidentified craft lands in Montana. Government officials deny knowledge. Alien contact? Witnesses report strange vessel in rural area. UFO community celebrates a sighting confirmed by multiple sources. "This is going to be a circus, Grandpa." "Then I'll charge admission." "You need a lawyer." "I need a lawyer, like I need a hole in my head. You destroyed their property. They're demanding compensation. This could get complicated. Their property was on my property. Self-defense." "Grandpa, you can't claim self-defense against drones." "Why not? They were trespassing." Tekka rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. "Okay, let me make some calls. I know a guy who knows a guy who might be able to help." The guy who knew a guy turned out to be Hendricks Calloway, a lawyer based out of Helena who specialized in property rights cases and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to defending his clients. He also had a deep, abiding hatred for federal overreach, which made him perfect for a case involving extraterrestrial authorities claiming jurisdiction over Montana soil. Hendricks drove out to Grell's ranch the next day in a truck that had seen better decades and wearing a suit that had seen better dry cleaners. He was 46, balding, and had the sort of face that suggested he'd spent most of his life squinting at legal documents under fluorescent lights. "Mr. Vantassoon," he said, shaking Grell's hand with a grip that felt like a vice. "I'm Hendricks Calloway. Your grandson tells me you've got a unique situation. I shot some drones. Now aliens want money. Doesn't seem unique to me." Hendricks smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who'd just been handed a case that would define his career and possibly rewrite international law. Or in this case, interplanetary law. "Tell me everything," he said. Grell told him everything. The drones, the noise, the shooting, the burial, the visit from Crinth, the demands for compensation, the complete disregard for Montana jurisdiction. Hendricks took notes on a yellow legal pad, nodding occasionally, his smile growing wider with each detail. "This is beautiful," he said when Grell finished. "Beautiful. Mr. Vantassoon, do you understand what you've just handed me? This is a case about property rights, jurisdictional authority, and the fundamental question of who gets to make laws in a given territory. It's every constitutional lawyer's dream. I just want them to leave me alone." "Oh, they'll leave you alone. After we're done with them, they'll leave everyone alone. Because we're going to establish a precedent that'll make it very clear that you can't just land on someone's property and start making demands, no matter how many star systems you represent." "I like the sound of that." "You should. Now, first thing we need to do is file a countersuit." Grell blinked. "A what now?" "A countersuit. They're claiming you destroyed their property. We're going to claim that they violated your property rights, caused emotional distress, and attempted to intimidate you with unlawful demands. We're going to ask for damages." "How much?" Hendricks's smile became predatory. "How much were those drones worth again?" He said 17 million each, so 51 million total. Let's ask for 60 million and see what happens. $60 million. Hey, They came to your house. They landed in your field. They made demands on your property. Emotional distress, loss of use of land, potential damage to livestock from the noise. We can make a case. Grell sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. I think I like you, Mr. Calloway. Call me Hendricks. And trust me, Mr. Vantersoon, before this is over, the galaxy is going to learn a very important lesson about property rights in Montana. The countersuit was filed 3 days later in the 11th Judicial District Court of Montana. It named the Quilvan Diplomatic Corps, the Galactic Council of Unified Species, and approximately 40 other organizations that Hendricks had gleefully pulled from Crinth's initial report. The filing made exactly 0 sense from a galactic perspective because, quite simply, no one had ever tried to sue the Galactic Council before. When the notification reached the Interspecies Relations Bureau, it caused what could only be described as institutional paralysis. The Bureau's lawyers, all 3,000 of them, gathered for an emergency meeting to discuss how this had happened. They sued us. Director Felix Morrigan couldn't believe what he was reading. An indigenous species from a non-member world sued the Galactic Council. According to their legal framework, yes, sir. The speaker was Clarinet Waveson, head of the legal department, who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days. They filed in something called district court, claiming violations of property rights, emotional distress, and unlawful intimidation. But we have no jurisdiction in their courts. That's exactly their point, sir. They're arguing that since we have no jurisdiction there, we had no right to make demands on their citizen. That's circular logic. No, sir, that's territorial sovereignty. It's actually quite elegant when you think about it. Felix's facial tendrils knotted themselves into what his species called the knot of infinite frustration. What do they want? 60 million of their dollars, a formal apology, and assurance that no further unauthorized surveillance will occur on the plaintiff's property. 60 million. Our drones were only worth... They're claiming emotional damages, sir. Apparently, being threatened by an alien diplomatic envoy on your own property is considered traumatic in their legal system. He shot our drones on his property, sir, which he claims is self-defense. The meeting dissolved into chaos. 17 different lawyers tried to speak at once, each proposing different strategies ranging from ignore it completely to file a counter suit to maybe we should just apologize and move on. What they eventually decided was much, much worse. They decided to test the humans' marksmanship. The logic, if you could call it that, went like this. If Grell Vantersoon had truly shot down 3 sophisticated reconnaissance drones with a primitive projectile weapon, then either he was extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily skilled. If he was lucky, then his claims of defending his property were just bluster, and they could argue that the destruction of the drones was accidental, reducing liability. If he was skilled, well, that was actually more concerning, but they'd deal with that later. The proposal came from the Military Assessment Division, a group of Quilvan who specialized in evaluating potential threats. They suggested a simple test. Send more drones. See if the human could repeat his performance. Absolutely not, Clarinet objected. That's entrapment or provocation or... I don't know what it is, but it's definitely against some law. It's reconnaissance, General Vorkith Stammerson argued. We need to assess the threat level. The threat level is a 73-year-old farmer who destroyed 51 million credits worth of equipment. By accident. We don't know it was an accident. That's the point. The argument raged for hours. Eventually, a compromise was reached. They would send new drones, but these would be clearly marked as diplomatic assets, transmitting a message in all Earth languages stating their peaceful intentions. Surely a reasonable person wouldn't shoot down drones that were obviously trying to communicate. This assumption, like so many before it, was about to be tested against the immovable object that was Grell Vantersoon's territorial instincts. The new drones arrived on a Tuesday morning, descending from the clouds like mechanical angels of bureaucracy. There were 5 of them this time, each broadcasting in English, Spanish, Mandarin, and 47 other languages. Peaceful observation mission. Do not be alarmed. We mean no harm. Grell heard the announcement from his porch. He set down his coffee, walked inside, retrieved his revolver, walked back outside, and carefully aimed at the lead drone. Should have learned the first time, he muttered, and fired. The shot was perfect. The drone sparked, spun, and crashed into the same haystack that had claimed its predecessor. The broadcast cut off mid-sentence. The remaining 4 drones attempted evasive maneuvers, which was hilarious to watch because they'd been programmed by beings who thought evasive maneuvers meant move in a predictable zigzag pattern that any competent shooter could track with ease. Grell shot down 2 more before his grandson's car came screaming up the driveway. "Grandpa, stop shooting! They're on my property, Tecker. They're talking to you. They're saying they're peaceful. They're also trespassing. Can't be both peaceful and a trespasser. That's just rude." One of the remaining drones fled. The last one attempted to rise above effective range, which might have worked if Grell hadn't been shooting at altitude since before Tecker was born. The final shot was a thing of beauty, a bullet arcing through morning air to strike a target 200 feet up and moving. "Grandpa!" "What?" "They were warned. Not my fault they don't listen." Tecker looked at the 4 new crashes, then at his grandfather, then at his phone where Hendricks was already calling. "Tell him 4 more, Grell said. "I'm keeping count for the lawsuit." The galaxy, for its part, was having what could only be described as a collective existential crisis. The test had been monitored by 17 different agencies. The data was undeniable. Grell Vantersoon had just destroyed 4 drones in under 30 seconds, including one that had been actively evading, using a weapon that by all accounts should have been completely ineffective against modern technology. The Military Assessment Division issued a report that used the phrase "unprecedented threat level" in every paragraph. The Technological Security Division couldn't explain how someone with no formal targeting systems had achieved such accuracy. The Xenological Studies Group suggested that maybe, possibly, potentially, humans had some sort of innate advantage when it came to hand-eye coordination that their scans had missed. And the Diplomatic Corps, already reeling from the lawsuit, now had to explain to the Galactic Council why they'd deliberately provoked someone who'd already proven capable of destroying their property. Felix Morrigan's next meeting with the Council did not go well. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Councillor Thremek said, her voice cold enough to freeze methane. "You sent more drones to a location where drones had already been destroyed, got 4 more destroyed, and your explanation is that you were testing the indigenous sentience capabilities. We needed to verify the threat level, Councillor. And now that threat level has been verified as extremely high. What is your plan?" "We're exploring diplomatic options." "You were already exploring diplomatic options, and those options got you sued. The human's legal claim has no standing under galactic law. The human's legal claim has standing under his law, which is what matters when you're on his planet." The council chamber erupted in arguments. The Trilaxian delegation insisted this was exactly why they'd opposed expanding reconnaissance to Class 7 worlds. The Vrex performed an interpretive dance that roughly translated to, "We told you so." The Zenith Collective just sat there looking smug because they'd been warning about Earth for decades, and nobody had listened. "We could send a military force," someone suggested. The chamber went silent. "Did you just suggest," Councillor Thremek said slowly, "that we invade a sovereign world because one of their citizens destroyed some drones? They've shown hostility toward our diplomatic efforts. They've shown hostility toward trespassing. There's a difference, but the principle is that we're supposed to be better than this. We're supposed to represent civilization, order, diplomatic solutions, not throwing a tantrum because some farmer shot our toys. More arguing, more dancing, more smug looks from the Zenith delegation. Finally, after 6 hours of debate, the Council reached a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for galactic diplomacy. They decided to challenge Grell Vantassoon to a formal marksmanship competition. The logic this time was actually sound. If the human won, they would publicly acknowledge his skill and withdraw their demands for compensation. If he lost, he would acknowledge that the destruction of the drones had been luck rather than skill, and they could proceed with the lawsuit. It was, essentially, a duel, but with lawyers watching. The challenge was delivered by Krinth, who'd drawn the short straw for most experience with human interaction, which was like saying he was the tallest dwarf. He landed in Grell's field for the second time, but this time he had a document prepared by 64 lawyers and translated into English by the best linguist the Quilven could muster. "Mr. Vantassoon," he said, "I bring a formal challenge from the Galactic Council." Grell read the document. It was 3 pages long and used the word "whereas" 47 times. "This is a challenge to a shooting contest. A marksmanship competition to determine skill level and establish contextual understanding of previous incidents. You want to see if I can do it again?" "Precisely!" Grell looked at Hendricks, who'd come to every meeting since taking the case. "What do you think?" "I think it's a trap." "What kind of trap?" "I don't know yet, but they wouldn't offer this unless they thought they could win." "Can they? Can they shoot better than you?" "I doubt it." Hendricks smiled. "Then we accept, but on our terms." The terms took 2 weeks to negotiate. The competition would be held on Grell's property, judged by neutral observers from Earth's military, using weapons chosen by both parties, with targets approved by independent assessors. The winner would be determined by accuracy, not speed or style. And most importantly, the results would be legally binding. Both parties signed, both parties prepared, and both parties were absolutely convinced they would win. The Quilven sent their champion, a being named Zerathis Pinnacle, who held the galactic record for long-distance precision targeting. He'd won 14 interplanetary competitions, could hit a target the size of a credit chip from 2 kilometers away, and had reflexes that operated on nanosecond scales. He arrived with equipment that cost more than most starships. Gravitic stabilizers, predictive targeting arrays, quantum precision calibration tools. His rifle, if you could call it that, looked like someone had mated a telescope with a computer and given it a trigger. Grell showed up with his revolver and a box of ammunition he'd bought at the hardware store. The contrast was not subtle. The competition was set for dawn on a Saturday, partly because that's when the light was best, partly because that's when Grell usually woke up anyway. 3 military observers arrived from Malmstrom Air Force Base, mostly because nobody else believed this was actually happening and someone needed to document it. The targets were set at various distances: 50 yards, 100 yards, 200 yards. Each shooter would have 3 shots at each distance. Most accurate total score would win. Zerathis went first. His equipment hummed and clicked, calculating wind speed, air density, gravitational variance, the rotation of the Earth, the phase of the moon, and probably what everyone had for breakfast. He fired 3 shots at 50 yards. All 3 hit dead center, grouped so tightly you could cover them with a dime. The military observers exchanged glances. This was going to be embarrassing. Grell stepped up, raised his revolver with one hand like he was swatting a fly, and fired 3 times without any apparent aiming process. All 3 shots hit dead center, not grouped as tightly as Zerathis's, but well within the acceptable margin. "Huh," Grell said. "Wind's picking up." 100 yards, Zerathis fired again. Perfect shots. Actually, more perfect than before, if that was possible. His equipment had adjusted for every conceivable variable. Grell fired 3 more times. Still dead center. "Grandpa," Tekka whispered, "how are you doing this?" "Doing what?" Hitting the target. Tekka, I've been shooting since before your mother was born. This is what I do. 200 yards. This was where it would matter. This was where the superior technology would make the difference. This was where. Zarathis fired 3 perfect shots. Grell paused, squinting at the target. This is too easy, he said. Grandpa, just shoot. No, I mean, this is too easy. What's the point of a competition if there's no challenge? The point is to win. But winning isn't interesting unless it's difficult. Hendrik stepped forward. Mr. Vantersoon, respectfully, please just shoot the target. Grell sighed and fired 3 times, all 3 hits. The final tally was counted. Zarathis, perfect score. Grell, also perfect score. The competition was a tie, which legally meant nothing was resolved. Grinth looked at the scores, looked at Zarathis, looked at Grell, and felt something in his mind break. How is this possible? Zarathis is using quantum targeting. You're using a primitive weapon. The mathematics don't work. Maybe your mathematics are wrong, Grell suggested. Mathematics can't be wrong. They're mathematics. Then maybe you're measuring the wrong things. This statement, delivered by a 73-year-old man who looked like he'd spent most of his life standing in wind, contained more philosophical depth than Crinth was prepared to handle. We must repeat the test, Zarathis insisted, with more difficult conditions. More difficult how? One of the Air Force observers asked. Moving targets, or adverse weather, or longer ranges. Kid, Grell said, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but I've got cattle to feed. This has been fun and all, but... One more round! Zarathis's voice cracked with desperation. Please, I must understand. Grell looked at Hendricks, who shrugged. Your call, Mr. Vantersoon. Fine. One more round. Moving targets, your choice of distance. Zarathis set up a drone, one of the few surviving examples of Quilvan technology that hadn't been shot down by Grell. It would fly a pattern at various speeds and altitudes. Each shooter would have 1 shot. Zarathis went first. His equipment calculated trajectories, predicted the drone's path, compensated for every possible variable. He fired, hit. Grell didn't even raise his revolver to eye level. He just pointed, fired, hit. And that's when Zarathis understood something that the entire Galactic Council had missed. Grell Vantersoon wasn't using technology because he didn't need technology. He'd spent 73 years developing an intuitive understanding of ballistics that no computer could match. He knew how bullets flew, the way birds know how to navigate, the way fish know how to swim. It wasn't something you could quantify. It was something you could only develop through decades of practice. Zarathis lowered his rifle. I concede, he said quietly. What? Crinth looked like he'd been slapped. You can't concede. The competition isn't... I concede. Zarathis turned to Grell. You are extraordinary. Grell shrugged. I'm just a guy who shoots things. But I appreciate you saying so. The formal concession meant that legally, Grell had won the competition. The Galactic Council would have to withdraw their demands and acknowledge that his shooting of the drones had been justified. But something else happened, something that nobody had predicted. Zarathis asked to buy the revolver. My rifle cost 4 million credits, he said. I will trade it for your weapon. Why? Grell asked, genuinely confused. Because it is not the tool that matters. It is the user, and I want to learn. Will you teach me? Grell looked at the alien, with his fancy equipment and his quantum targeting, and saw something he recognized, someone who wanted to be better. Tell you what, Grell said, keep your rifle, but come back next week and I'll show you how to shoot without all that fancy stuff. Fair? Zarathis agreed immediately, and that was how a 73-year-old cowboy from Montana became the galaxy's most sought-after marksmanship instructor. The news spread fast. Within a month, 17 different species had sent requests to Grell's ranch asking if he would teach their military forces. Within 2 months, the Galactic Council formally apologized and withdrew all legal claims. Within 3 months, There was a waiting list. Grell started charging $200 an hour, which Hendricks immediately tripled because "You're teaching aliens to shoot, Grandpa. Charge what you're worth." The ranch became a destination. Beings from across the galaxy would arrive, pay their fees, and spend weeks learning the fundamentals of marksmanship from someone who'd never heard of quantum targeting or gravitic stabilization. They learned about breathing, about patience, about the feel of a trigger and the weight of a weapon. They learned that sometimes the simplest tools, in the right hands, were more effective than any technology. And they learned about property rights in Montana, because Grell never let them forget that they were guests on his land, subject to his rules, and that respect for territory was just as important as respect for skill. The Galactic Council, for their part, had learned a valuable lesson about assumptions and authority. They revised their reconnaissance protocols, established formal procedures for contacting new civilizations, and added an entire chapter to their diplomatic handbook about the concept of property rights and why ignoring them was a bad idea. Tecker moved back to Montana to help manage his grandfather's new business. He set up a website, handled scheduling, dealt with translation services, and occasionally had to explain to visiting aliens that no, they could not bring their quantum rifles to practice sessions that defeated the entire purpose. Hendricks Calloway became famous in legal circles for successfully defending a client against the Galactic Council, which was a sentence that still made him laugh whenever he said it. He wrote a book about the case, gave lectures, and occasionally showed up at the ranch to watch aliens try to hit targets with weapons that predated space travel, and Grell kept living his life exactly as he always had. He fed his cattle, drank his coffee, taught shooting to anyone willing to learn, and defended his property from unauthorized intrusions. The galaxy had come to him. He hadn't asked for it, hadn't wanted it, but he dealt with it the same way he dealt with everything else, directly, honestly, and with a weapon he knew how to use. 3 years after the initial incident, a historian from the Zenith Collective came to interview Grell for a documentary about first contact. They sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Do you regret any of it?" the historian asked. "The conflict, the lawsuits, the complications?" Grell thought about it. "Regret shooting those drones? No. They were trespassing. Regret how it all turned out? Also no. Made some money, met interesting people, and they finally learned to ask permission before flying things over my land. But you changed galactic history." "Did I? Seems to me galactic history just ran into Montana history, and Montana history didn't budge. That's not change. That's just stubbornness. You've become a symbol of resistance against authority, of the power of individuals against systems. I'm a symbol of shooting straight and standing your ground. If people want to make that political, that's their business." The historian smiled. "What would you say to civilizations encountering Earth for the first time?" Grell looked at the camera, and his expression was as serious as anyone had ever seen it. "Ask permission, respect boundaries, and for God's sake, don't assume that because someone's technology is older than yours, they're less capable of defending themselves." The documentary ended with those words, and they became something of a motto throughout certain corners of the galaxy. Ships arriving at Earth started requesting permission before entering atmosphere. Diplomatic missions filed proper paperwork, and reconnaissance drones were very careful about whose property they flew over. But the story didn't really end there. Stories like this never really end. They just keep rippling outward, changing things in ways both large and small. The Quilvan Reconnaissance Corps made Grell an honorary member and gave him a ceremonial badge that he stuck in a drawer and forgot about. Zerethis became Grell's most successful student and went on to revolutionize marksmanship training throughout the Quilvan military, emphasizing intuition over technology. The 3 drones that started everything remained buried in the back 40 acres. slowly corroding in the Montana soil, monuments to the day that bureaucracy met territorial stubbornness and lost. And Grell Vantersoon kept sitting on his porch, drinking coffee, watching his land, and occasionally shooting things out of the sky when they got too close without asking permission first. Because some things, no matter how much the galaxy changed, stayed exactly the same. The Montana sky, the weight of a good revolver, and the fundamental principle that a man's property was his own, and anyone who disagreed was welcome to test that theory. They usually didn't. And the few who did learned very quickly that age, technology, and galactic authority meant absolutely nothing compared to 73 years of practice and the unshakable conviction that respect for property was the foundation of civilization. Whether that civilization spanned 400 star systems or 40 acres in rural Montana made no difference whatsoever.